call this meeting to order. Good evening and welcome to the November 17th, 2022 meeting of the West Sacramento Planning Commission. First, we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance, led by our own Mr. Sean.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, for liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Tonight's agenda is available on the counter along with request to speak cards. A reminder to everyone that requests to speak cards should be completed and turned into the clerk prior to the completion of any staff presentation. For those speakers wishing to speak on items not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of the commission, please write item A on your card. All speakers will be limited to 3 minutes. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and televised, so all speakers, in order to be recognized, must be called on by the chair and come forward to the microphone. Speaking in public may cause some individuals to be uncomfortable, so everyone is asked to be professional and respectful at all times. Okay. General Administration Function Part 1. Presentations by public on matters not on the agenda within the jurisdiction of this commission. Are there any requests to speak cards?
We have no public comments on this item.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to number 2, correspondence and staff communications from the Planning Commission Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Chair Berliner. Just 2 quick items to note. Applications to be appointed and reappointed to city commissions, that deadline's been extended to December 2nd. So I encourage everyone to submit that. And please make sure once you've submitted it that you get some form of confirmation email back. We had one other commissioner who had thought she had submitted it all, but turned out she hadn't. And so if you don't get that confirmation, email back. I'm not sure what the exact language is, but you may not have actually completed it somehow. So please look for that when you submit and reapply. And also, we have received a few public comments for item number 5, and we provided those to the commission earlier. And I believe Tanya also has some hard copies if anyone needs the public comment we've received thus far on item number 5. Otherwise, that concludes staff's communications at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Tilley. Next up, we have disclosure of ex parte communications. Does anyone have anything to report on for tonight? So I have spoken to a few residents about item number 5. Do I need to go into more detail than that? Okay. Let's move on to the consent agenda, consideration and approval of the minutes from the October 20th, 2022 commission meeting.
I move to approve.
We have a motion from Commissioner Sablon.
I will second.
And a second from Commissioner Steger. Madam Clerk, can we do the roll?
Yes.
Commissioner Steger?
Aye.
Commissioner DeAnda?
Aye.
Commissioner Sablon?
Aye.
Chair Berliner?
Aye. Thank you. 4 ayes, 0 noes. Motion passes. Okay. Next up, we have is item number 5, public hearing regarding proposed municipal code changes pertaining to retail cannabis sales and micro businesses. Mr. Tilley?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to do this one. Been a little while since I've been up here, but looking forward to it. So I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to go through with you tonight to try to walk you through all of this. It's a little bit lengthy, but I'll try to be concise, and I'll certainly take questions along the way or at the end or both, whatever the commission prefers. So just to start off with a little background, we are here to talk about retail cannabis sales, also known colloquially as a dispensary, and also micro businesses, and I'll explain a little more about what those are as we get into it. Those have been prohibited in our community since about 2010, but clearly the whole world on where it relates to cannabis has changed quite a bit since that time, specifically when Proposition 64 passed in 2016. the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, I believe AMA is, I believe, what it was known as. And also right around that time is when the city started to entertain non-retail cannabis businesses, and many of those have come through your commission, since that time. Those are the distributors, the cultivators, the manufacturers, no retail, involved with those, even some testing labs. So 3 of them are operational now, and we're learning everything we can on the non-retail side of things, but tonight we're here to talk about retail. So this is an item that the City Council decided on its own as part of its strategic planning efforts this year and last year. That's something they wanted to entertain, is going to retail here in our community going forward. So everything we're bringing forward to you tonight, and then what we will ultimately bring forward to the City Council, is in response to the council itself deciding that this was a priority item that goes on the list, as we say, and is something now we're here to sort that out for you. So Commission may recall we did workshop this very high level earlier this year, and also prior to that we went to the City Council, try to get some initial direction on how we might start to digest this program and what were some of the policy objectives that were most important. So tonight we're going to go through these sections of the ordinance and we'll propose ordinance revisions. We'll talk about microbusinesses a little bit. That's a license type under the state's licensing program, and I'll get into what those are a little bit more. Retail storefront cannabis, the fabled dispensary, is part of the package, and also non-storefront retail. These are delivery-only businesses where there's no customer traffic, no real visibility. It's purely a delivery only. We'll discuss a new program or initiative we're starting called a city cannabis license. This would be something that would be evaluated administratively. And then we will also do development agreements. We're proposing to do development agreements with each of these license types, not that dissimilar to some of the development agreements that we have brought before this commission on the non-retail side. We anticipate those being pretty similar in most of its construct. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about what we anticipate the process is going to be for how we will entertain storefront retail in particular. And then we'll also touch on, as this relates back to equity, which is, I believe, a particularly important component of this for the City Council. All right, we'll start with microbusinesses. This is a license type under the state's licensing program. And what it really does is allows as name implies, a smaller operation to conduct multiple cannabis-related activities all under one roof, but with some limitations. For example, the cultivation could be a maximum of 10,000 square feet. Most, full-size cultivation operations can be 100,000, square feet, in scale. So they would have to do at least 3 of those cannabis-related things, which can include retail, and we will be, addressing that as it relates to microbusinesses. Microbusinesses, we would anticipate handling much similar to how we've done the non-retail businesses, where we would propose that they be in some of the business park and industrial districts, where there is buildings that are more suitable and perhaps even more affordable for a microbusiness. One thing that is different as we're proposing to go forward is we're no longer recommending doing a use permit for our cannabis businesses. And that's sort of a reflection of, I think, the way use permits are being viewed, especially by the courts, in general, not just related to cannabis. They're becoming much more treated like a property right, and it becomes very, very difficult for the city to ever try to rescind one of those, should there ever be an issue with any kind of business operating on a use permit, not just cannabis. And then we would also apply this new city cannabis license, which is an administrative tool. And so to establish this, we would need to amend Title V. That's the business licensing section of our municipal code, Doesn't come up at the Planning Commission very often, but it is an important part of our municipal code that the staff, and especially in my team, we do work with every day. So now we'll get into the non-storefront delivery only model. This, as the name implies, there's no storefront, there's no customer traffic. People would place an order presumably online, and then it will be delivered to whoever has ordered it at their home or wherever else they may be. We are proposing, again, they'll be similar to the non-retail with the development agreement with many similar provisions in it that what you have seen previously. Also no use permit. And we're also, much like the micro businesses, proposing that these would go in business park and industrial zoning districts, since this is probably akin to like a mini warehouse in many ways and doesn't really need to pay and to be in a retail area with that visibility when they're not looking to have visibility. Their visibility is all online when people place orders. And then, of course, a city cannabis license, very similar to the micro business. So I'm going to get into how we're proposing to treat storefront, but I want to sort of give you a summary of how some of the other jurisdictions around us that do currently allow storefront retail, how they approach it. There's a little variation there, but some of the consistent themes is some form of discretionary review. And some communities have a tax, like Davis and Sacramento, and other communities like us and Woodland do not have a tax. And hence there's some form of contractual arrangement typically in those communities, much like how we have done it here with our non-retail businesses. So there's some variation, but everyone up there is still doing some form of discretionary review on their, from a land use standpoint, on their storefront retail. And I'm going to talk about storefront retail a lot and sort of emphasize that because, you know, the bulk of our discussion will be about the storefront retail model and less so about the microbusiness and non-storefront, which don't seem to garner quite as much attention as the storefront model with its being visible and obviously a place where you can go. So for West Sacramento, our proposed storefront retail cannabis parameters. We would do the development agreement and city cannabis license very similarly to the other forms. We are proposing in this ordinance a 250-foot buffer from schools with at least 100 student enrollment, commercial daycare, and similar facilities. In the text of the ordinance, we've also be clear to specify what that does not include in the ordinance. And so the state limit in state law is 600 feet. The local agencies can approve something less than that, either as a matter of course or on a case-by-case basis if the ordinance provides for it. We're looking for a little bit smaller buffer because when we first started this effort and applied a standard 600-foot buffer, it actually eliminated most of the areas where we were thinking that would be a good place for just to kind of, as the crow flies, doing it that coarsely. So we didn't want to sort of have a limit that end up prohibiting us from having any of these in areas where we think that might be a good idea to have them. So, but on West Capitol Avenue, where we still remain having a lot of areas we want to work on, we are proposing a 500 buffer between storefront cannabis businesses to try to avoid any type of over-concentration along West Capitol Avenue. And then a little bit about the application process for this. We are proposing that ultimately we would have a hybrid of a merit-based and lottery system for the storefront only. There are several reasons for that, but one of the biggest reasons, the more practical reason, is that if this ultimately is approved by the council, we do anticipate getting several applications or potential applications for storefront, potentially more than we can process at any given time. Some applicants may want to be vying for the same spot, or some may be vying for a spot on West Capitol Avenue where with that buffer means maybe only one could go in that block. So we do have to have some procedures there in anticipation that we get, several applications. Maybe if we only get 2 or 3 and they're spread out around town, maybe it's less of an issue. but we are anticipating getting potentially several applications. So, as part of this, we also need to decide where storefront retail could go or should go in our community. We're looking at it citywide and focusing on areas that are primarily of high traffic, high visibility areas, not often far-flung locations where there's not a lot of eyes on it and otherwise traffic going by. This will be independent of the underlying zoning, although as you may expect, these are primarily going in commercial and mixed use and business park areas where there is already commercial property available. Certainly not going to put it in the middle of a single family neighborhood, that kind of thing. And so we're looking at short-term, existing commercial areas, but also considering longer-term planned commercial areas that have yet to be built in our town. And I'm going to show a map here graphically here on the next slide to show where we are attempting to look at this as broadly across this whole city as we possibly can. So this is a map of the whole city. I know it's a little hard to read there, so Tanya's going to zoom in on certain areas. But so far, what we have been proposing is, from a short-term standpoint, there are some spots along West Capitol Avenue, closer to the harbor and intersection, and also the Jefferson intersection. We're looking at some of the business park areas along Industrial Boulevard, west of Harbor. Some of the areas of the Bridge District where new retail is being built as we speak could be a potential option. Some of the, what we call the snow cone area or pizza slice area, which is like the Drever Soule Street, just on the east side of Jefferson. And then some of the stuff up on Triangle Court, right down the street from the police, seem to be potentially a good location, as well as some sites on Sacramento Avenue where there's existing or planned commercial and mixed use.
Mr. Tilley, can I just interrupt you for a second? So one of the things I do notice, and I'm also doing this as a reminder to the people who just walked in, that all public comment on this item has to be provided to our city clerk before the end of the staff presentation. So I'm just buying you guys a little bit more time. But I did want to ask, a noticeable missing commercial area would be, I believe it's called River Point Marketplace, the IKEA shopping center. That seems to be missing from this map.
All right, well, part of what we will be ultimately seeking tonight when the council's recommendation is a recommendation to the council on the whole package, but part of it could be recommendations on adjustments to this map, adding areas in or taking areas out as the commission sees fit. But that is certainly one area could be for further consideration by the Planning Commission.
Okay, thank you.
So Tanya, if we could just go south. So in Southport area, we're showing Town Center, the Westbridge Plaza, where Lowe's is. There's the commercial corridor along Jefferson, near Linden, South Linden down to Marshall, where there's existing commercial. And then there's also planned commercial in each of the villages going forward, such as in Liberty, River Park, and Yarborough. Those will be definitely kind of longer term plays, but we wanted to make sure that we were considering this broadly, noting that if some of our appointed elected officials want to narrow that down, that's fine, but we at least want to start off broadly for provide options, potential options citywide. So we're going to talk about the process here a little bit in more detail here, how we expect to entertain storefront retail. Once we have gone through this process, and if the council ultimately approves the ordinance, part of that is directing the city manager to develop administrative procedures for how we will actually, in day-to-day life, entertain applications for storefront retail. We anticipate that sometime in 2023 issuing a call for proposals, akin to an RFP, when many of us see in our other lives, where it'll be opened up for some duration of time, maybe a month or something like that, where we would be entertaining initial applications for storefront retail. That proposal would include sort of our general requirements, what some of the scoring criteria may be. And this is all under the premise that we may get numerous applications. It'll describe sort of what the steps are going to be after that. And we will look for, obviously, complete applications once that time is closed, very similar to how we do other things. We need to make sure that we're getting all the information that we need. Our biggest challenge on most of our cannabis business is really knowing kind of who the owner is and how they're structured, things of that nature. So let's go on to the next one. And then once we've done that initial screening, mostly for completeness, we will score them, and we will principally use our city consultant HDL, which works on cannabis matters throughout the state and really is kind of a subject matter expert in this field. They will evaluate all of them. We will determine the eligibility list. And at that time, we'll need to determine if we actually do need to employ a lottery or not. That's really going to come down to how many we get and where they're going to go. But for now, we're assuming we could get several. At this stage, those that are at this level would be able then to actually formally submit for the development agreement application, go through that process, come to the Planning Commission for hearing on the development agreement before the Planning Commission, and then proceed to City Council for final action, just like all other development agreements. So the Planning Commission is still going to have its opportunity to weigh in on storefront, as well as the City Council in a discretionary matter, and also in an advertised public hearing before the Planning. So I apologize, it's a little hard to read when I see it up on the big screen, but we are working on already some potential evaluation criteria and scoring, some components that we'll be looking for in terms of just their overall business plan, some of their employment objectives, and also really a more detailed description of how they feel like their business is going to fit in the particular location that we're going to. We do want to make sure that these businesses are hopefully energizing the neighborhoods around them rather than trying to track from. So revenue will be a key part of this, and will be a component of the development agreement. And much like our other development agreements, a safety and security plan will be important, noting that this is definitely a different type of application than our non-retail ones, where they're in a large, typically a large warehouse, and it's armored to the teeth, and no people can go there. A storefront where people need to go, a little different animal. And obviously, any types of other nuisances such as odors, would need to be addressed to make sure that ultimately a storefront is operated in a way that works in the neighborhood, doesn't cause any significant issues. So another important part of the draft ordinance before you is seeking ultimately council direction for us to develop an equity licensing pilot program. This is really came directly from the council, is at least the notion of equity needs to be part of this. So it still needs to be fleshed out some more by the council from a policy standpoint. But at staff level at this time, we're thinking big on this, keeping all options on the table for how we might stand up an equity program particularly for those that have been impacted by past drug policies and the fabled war on drugs. See if we can stand up a program where it would engender some success, either in terms of potentially an equity applicant maybe owning a business, or it could also be trying to employ more and more people that hopefully could graduate maybe to higher levels in this industry, to try to help them get in the door, and for those who've been disproportionately impacted in the past. It could go so far as potentially the city acquiring a building and being the landlord for an equity applicant. Right now, we're going to want to leave all things on the table when it comes to equity and get your input on that, and then really get a lot of policy input from the city council once we go there. So these are all potential components of an equity program. The key tonight is that the Planning Commission supports having an equity program as part of this. And this was something we would need to flesh out and develop a lot more once we hear from the council. But for now, we want to at least bring some options forward of what it could include to see sort of what the Planning Commission and Council's tolerance is for some of these, some of these initiatives that have sort of span the gamut of, level of effort investment by the city. So this is kind of a bit of a roadmap, a bit of a recap of how we would entertain, or at least how we propose to entertain storefront retail. The RFP process, of course, this is all assuming that the ordinance is ultimately approved by the council. The evaluation and ranking, then the lottery if necessary, and then we'll commence the development agreement work, and CEQA come to the Planning Commission for your recommendation on the development agreement, and then go to City Council for final action on the development agreement, as all development agreements go. Once that has been adjudicated, we would start working on the city cannabis license with the applicant, and hopefully on a parallel track, they can be working on getting their state license, doing any building permits they may need to do to rehab or improve a space that they're going into. And then the other thing that's important is that the license, would be renewed annually. And, we would anticipate that would be fairly straightforward if a business is operating in compliance and is not having issues. But it gives us an opportunity to verify that the safety and security plan is still in effect and is operational, that they still have a state license, that the ownership, hasn't changed, all of that stuff. So if everything stays, fairly status quo year to year, I expect that to be a fairly routine process. And we want it to be that way because our end goal here is to have these businesses be successful in our community. So just sort of our overall next steps. We are seeking your formal recommendation on the ordinance to the City Council tonight after you take public comment. And then we will go to City Council at our next available City Council meeting. And then presumably early next year, we can start really fleshing out some of the administrative procedures and the equity pilot program. And if everything stays on track, it's possible by maybe third quarter next year, we could start entertaining storefront retail. I don't see it happening before that, but right now, assuming everything goes kind of along the way and the council is on board with what we're proposing, it's possible it could be sometime quarter three. So our staff recommendation to you tonight is to conduct the public hearing and then ultimately vote to adopt the resolution that's before you, which recommends that the City Council adopt the ordinance that would effectuate this program here in our community by amending Titles 5 of the Municipal Code, which is business licensing, and Title 17, which is zoning. So with that, I'll close my presentation, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Also have City Attorney with us tonight, and also our Community Development Director, Andrea Aus, is with us also tonight. So at this time, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tilley. Do we have any questions from commissioners before we open it up for public comment? No? Okay. So I would like to say a few things before we actually open it up for the public hearing. First of all, I do want to thank city staff for all of their hard work on the item. Secondly, I'm really happy to see all the people in the audience. This is, a lot more people than normal. And I expect that there will be a lot of public comment on this item. With that being said, I know that this is a somewhat divisive topic. I'm going to hold everyone to the 3-minute time limit. If you go beyond the 3 minutes, the city clerk will stop your feed to the microphone and I will cut you off. I want to give everyone an opportunity to speak. I expect we will get public comment about possible locations for retail cannabis. I want to stress the importance of the option of having these businesses throughout the city. They should not only be located in one section of the city, but distributed as to not label one portion of the city. Thank you, Madam Clerk. I'd like to now open it up, the public hearing.
Richard Miller.
Good evening. Thank you, Rich Miller. I was here approximately 12 years ago when they went into place, and I was very disappointed by that. With 65% of the state not having access, I must commend you for moving forward in addressing this issue. As a local resident from Sandpiper Way, I know the importance of cannabis in this industry is necessary, and especially for those that cannot get into the Sacramento region to receive their cannabis. I support moving forward with an equity program and those that have been impacted on the war on drugs. I think it's necessary, but I also think it's important that we include our own community and people within this community the opportunity to set up a business in this community and to hopefully keep out some of those larger corporations throughout the states from coming in here and making this another cash cow and not really considering the people of this community. As a resident, I think that's most important. And also, having worked in the cannabis industry and with patients for 31 years now, starting in San Francisco with HIV and AIDS patients, I know it's more important than ever to have dispensary owners and individuals that are educated in the importance and pharmacological effects of cannabis, as well as addressing the adult use and those patients that are using cannabis for the first time, and providing that education and necessary service to this community. Having said that, I know it's very expensive to set up dispensaries, having worked in dispensaries for 10 years now. And I know that there will be an overconcentration. I know the floodgates will open up for applications in this city. So what I'm asking you to consider, since it is an expensive process to get the businesses started, to actually consider taking the applicants first before the locations of those businesses are disclosed for conditional use permit. I think this will cut down a lot of waste of time and energy and hopes of a lot of individuals moving forward with this industry as we move forward here in West Sacramento. I thank the staff for their hard work and continued efforts to move this forward, and I would ask for your aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deanna Garcia.
Good evening. It feels good to be back in the room here in the chambers. Thank you tonight for your time on moving the retail cannabis further in the city here of West Sacramento. I have entered 15 city retail competitions since regulations have opened up to adult use. And the time from the ordinance passing with the city council to the time of the Lucky Award winners opening their doors is on average 4 years, 4 years of time of holding up a building, paying rent, leaving a building vacant in the city. When these competitions start, you'll probably get about 50 licenses, applicants that come looking for these licenses. Maybe you'll award 4 or 5 licenses. But 50 buildings, if you ask for a building to be part of the application process, will be held up during this time. Maybe even 55, maybe some companies will get 1 or 2 buildings. And during this process, the city will have vacant buildings, which vacant buildings lead to high crime. They lead to non-tax dollars being collected, non-business going on in these vacant buildings. So I'm asking that when you start this process, not to have a building as a requirement for the applicant, but yet wait till you have your 80% higher in scores on the applicants to do then a qualified lottery, which is the city's least liable path to action to picking a final award winning of the retail licenses. And just the budget of holding a building for 2 to 3 to 4 years while you're waiting to be chosen or waiting to actually get your occupancy permit cost anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000, depending on your rent, the insurance, the upkeep, the maintenance that needs to be done on this building while you're holding it. So that really leaves out the equity people and the small business owners of West Sacramento here in the community that would like to try to have a retail storefront in their own cities, when you're asking for a building and it eats up through a large portion of your startup budget to hold a building for that long. So just something to keep in mind while you're going through tonight's process. Thank you for moving this forward, and thank you for being here in public.
Thank you.
Kimberly Cargile.
Good evening, Planning Commission and staff. Thank you for having us here tonight. My name is Kimberly Cargile. I'm the CEO of a therapeutic alternative storefront dispensary in East Sacramento, and I'm also a proud graduate of River City High School class of 1999, the old high school, if you remember the old one. So after graduating from Humboldt State University, I came back to Sacramento and I became a vocal advocate for cannabis regulations to protect consumers, patients, the environment, and public safety. And it's been a long road, but we've made huge progress. I've helped pass probably about 25 local ordinances throughout Northern California and now have 7 dispensaries throughout Northern California. I've learned a lot through this process. I read over our proposed ordinance, and I find it very well written. A few of my notes are as follows. First, the qualified lottery is a very good idea. I've won numerous applications in the local process, and just about every process has ended in a lawsuit, not from me, but by someone who lost. I've also lost many, but I don't believe in suing the city. But anyways, the cities go through a lot, and the winners do too, because they get named in the lawsuit, and everybody pays a lot of money. So the qualified lottery is a great idea. I haven't seen it happen, but it's an excellent idea, which will reduce the liability on the city. Next, I highly recommend allowing the applicants to choose their building after they have been approved or been chosen from the lottery. There is an approved zone that will be passed by Planning Commission and City Council, and there's only so many buildings in that area. So you should expect about 50 applications or more. Everywhere that I've been has had at least 50 applications. There's not that many buildings in the green zone that are currently available. Every building in the green zone will stay empty for 2 to 3 years. I know you don't think the application process is going to take that long. No city does. Everyone I've been in has 2 to 3 years of empty buildings. So I think it would be best for the community of West Sacramento to choose the applicants and then tell the applicants, go choose a building in the green zone once they've been chosen. Then you won't have all these empty buildings for a number of years here in West Sacramento. Lastly, I want to commend the city for thinking about social equity. The war on drugs has been a war on people, and it has greatly affected citizens of West Sacramento. My father was arrested twice. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he was arrested twice for cannabis. And I was taken away from him and did not get to see him until I was in high school when I moved to West Sacramento. And he's a great man. He's an architect, worked for the state. That's why we ended up in West Sacramento, so he could work for the state, for Caltrans downtown close by. I still have a great relationship with him. He's a wonderful guy, and he's a Vietnam vet who used cannabis as medicine prior to it being legal.
Thank you, Ms. Cargile.
Joe Ramirez.
Hi, good evening, Commission, Planning Commission. Thank you so much for taking your time this evening, being here. Obviously, we show up once in a while, but you are here all the time. And to David Tilley, thank you so much for all the work in the past decade getting this to this point. The city of West Sacramento, I think, is in a need for the extra revenue. Woodland, I had the great honor of helping the process along in Woodland. So I feel like I'm an expert now going through the process in Woodland. On Tuesday on election night, Measure K passed. So the city council now has power to tax the cannabis retail part of it. And so, it's taken over 2 years, obviously, about 10 or more in the city of Woodland. But, just, I support it, obviously. I want to hit the equity issue. I think that needs to be up front, key part of it. And I think that's a misnomer, the group that just went up about the expect 50 or more applicants. You might get about a dozen or so, but they're not going to hold up all these vacancies. Actually, the people that are hurting are the people that own the buildings. They need somebody to be renting. If there's no businesses in there, they're going to be empty anyways. And then also, that kind of cuts down on the availability for other people and other businesses other than the group that just went up to sit on these places for 2 or 3 years. I think the process could be quicker, obviously, if you guys support it. I think it's a great deal for police, revenue for streets, and things of that nature. If the city has problems, this could be a way to address that. Getting shields for officers, getting books for kids, things like that. And I agree, Aria, about the citywide, having the city be open to it. Some cities, original talks in Woodland were, having it in the warehouse area. It needs to be in high traffic density areas where these businesses can make money. The more money they make, the more money the city and the county, the state will make. And there's also revenue too for cities that partake in cannabis retail so that they can get extra revenue for police officers. Security is really tight at these places with lots of video cameras and things like that. So, people can sleep at night. And so, just in closing, I will be, applying here in West Sacramento, and just being a key partner within the community, I think is really key in the application, and having people of equity.
Thank you.
We have no additional requests to speak on this item.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing. So I'll bring it back to the commission. I'm sure there are questions because I have a whole page of them. Before I ask questions, would anyone like to ask questions? Commissioner Steger. Oh, okay. Okay.
So I have some questions for staff. I think these are just more technical, not that controversial, I think. But so, Mr. Tilley, you mentioned that the micro businesses and retail storefront and non-retail storefront wouldn't need a conditional use permit. Is that something we're also removing for the types of businesses, cannabis businesses that we've already been permitting?
That's not being proposed, right now.
Okay.
But it could be something we may look at going forward on the non-retail side. But it's the taking away the use permit requirement is really bigger than just, cannabis. It's related to other matters as courts have interpreted, the law related to that. So we may change that going forward, but we're not entertaining that, certainly not right now.
And then are we planning to hire additional staff for cannabis?
I suspect there could become a need for that if this really gets going and gets hot and there's, audits and other revenues that may need to be, established. It's entirely possible we may need some additional horsepower on staff if this really gets going in a big way, the way some of the speakers have intimated that we could get numerous applications right out of the chute.
Sorry, just a few other questions. Can you speak a little to the building requirement that several commenters spoke on? Is that a requirement of our application process, and is that typically what is done in other jurisdictions, and the reasoning for that?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. I'm sympathetic to the points made by the applicants or potential applicants on that front. I do think, however, that it would be very important for our decision makers to know exactly where someone is proposing a storefront. Those areas, are kind of, when you look at the citywide map, it's kind of broad, but when you sort of zoom in on a given area, we kind of need to know if we've tried to, on the map, for example, already try to take out areas where we know they're already right next to a school or a daycare, commercial daycare, things like that. So we've tried to at least do some of that work in advance. And so what we have been working on this, and I'm going to ask Mr. City Attorney to jump in a little bit too, is what form of building identification would be necessary. I don't think we're going to be looking at someone at that stage to already have a lease, signed or have purchased a building, that kind of thing, even though I know people are already doing that. But we do want to see that there's at least some level of formal intent before we go too far.
Yeah, and so an additional thing to keep in mind is that once we get to the development agreement stage with an applicant, by then we'll definitely need to have a site locked in, because that's one of the requirements for entering into a development agreement, is to be able to show site control. So we're still working out the details of how much of the location, like what level of commitment we would be looking for at the initial stage. That's still something we're discussing at the staff level. But there does come a time where an applicant really needs to be tied to a site before we can go through with all of the approvals. There's no way to just give somebody everything they need to be ready and set up shop and then have them pick a location.
Yeah, we recognize it's a little bit of chicken and the egg, and that's just part of the fundamentals of a development agreement. For any type of development agreement, is the party you're entering it with has to have real property interest. So we don't necessarily need that, right at the outset, but we will need that not too long thereafter. Certainly, I would, we want to make sure that, a landlord is truly indeed okay with having a cannabis business. Some of our landlords may not be open to that for whatever reason. So we're trying to find the sweet spot between having the bar be not too low but not too high, so that we can get a broad mix of potential applicants, hopefully be able to have a robust equity program also, and hopefully have the facilities, distributed, throughout the city, as Chair Berliner was noting.
Thank you. And I do appreciate staff's efforts in trying to walk that line. You do need that information to review the application and the plans and such. So I do understand that. And then the last question I have, at least for now, is the overlay we're doing, is that something that's typically done in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, many other communities have adopted something, loosely referred to as a green zone.
Okay.
And not tie it to underlying zoning. For example, here, some of our fortunately for us, most of our commercial areas existing and especially existing ones are not in great proximity to existing, residential areas. So some of those issues have kind of been solved by ourselves, just by our own existing geography. But we tried to look at this from a more practical standpoint of areas that may have some availability and suitable buildings, but trying to have stuff all over town to try to, leave people options and not have it focused in one area, which would just then drive all the costs up for everyone and maybe be a big barrier to entry for, some of the fabled little guys out there, so to speak, versus some of the big companies that have, some of them have 20 or 30 dispensaries across the whole state.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sablon. I'm actually going to follow up with a couple of questions from Commissioner Sablon. First of all, since we have the map up, I would like to discuss the lack of the River Point Marketplace on this map as a potential retail overlay. I don't know, I'm not sure why it's not there, but I think that A lot of the public comment that we got prior to the meeting was for a lot of concern about, you know, retail cannabis being near the high school, being near schools in general, being near daycare facilities, whereas that market, that shopping area is not near high schools, it's not near daycare facilities. In fact, it's not near residential whatsoever, except for maybe a few apartment buildings on Harbor Boulevard. But I don't even think those would be within the 500-foot radius.
Yeah, we certainly didn't exclude that area, you know, deliberately, or should I say intentionally. So I believe it is an area we could bring forth to the council if that was the ultimate direction of the planning commission, to include River Point in this.
I know that we're not ready to move anything, but is that something that the commission would be okay including? Yes?
Yeah, the overlay seems pretty straightforward, so I'm just wondering on what grounds that was excluded from this.
Yeah, that may have just firstly been an oversight on our part. It wasn't certainly done consciously.
And there are obviously portions of Jefferson south of, that looks like 15th Street, but north of Stone, that may have also been, you know, that I know it's close to residential, being that I live 500 feet within 500 feet of Jefferson Boulevard. But was there a reason those were not, that strip of Jefferson was not included?
I know the area you're referring to, and we've seen a couple of projects, you know, come through the planning commission in those areas, and unfortunately they haven't come to fruition, you know, for whatever reason. Those are fairly small lots, and we anticipate that many of the businesses would be in a landlord-tenant model, and so we're certainly not opposed to including that area. It just doesn't seem to be particularly ripe right now. But again, if the commission wants us to add that and for council consideration, certainly something we would do.
Okay. I want to pass the questions over to other commissioners before I go on my long list of questions. Commissioner DeAnda?
Thank you. Just wondering if there was any discussion or thought, or if in other jurisdictions there's been a broader pilot of the program overall, where, you know, say a 10-year or some sunset on the provisions to ensure that it's having the desired effects within the city, or if it's not. Is that something that's done elsewhere, I guess?
I mean, if like it had like a sunset clause. I'm not familiar with another jurisdiction having, you know, such a clause. Clearly, this is going to need to be a living, breathing, you know, effort as the industry as a whole evolves, and at the state level, how this continually evolves. Clearly, the industry is having some struggles, you know, statewide, and part of that is because so many communities still prohibit storefront, or in some cases, all forms of cannabis uses. So I would anticipate that, you know, once we get this up and running and, you know, maybe a few businesses open, we see how it's going. And I imagine we'd certainly want to, you know, modify the ordinance once we get some more real world experience a couple more years down the road.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ensure that, and I suppose that would be the way, that if there were issues with, say, the overlay requirements, I mean, those could always be amended.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It would, you know, be by ordinance. So it'd come to planning commission first, and then council, because this would be adopted by ordinance. So I'm really encouraged and excited by the staff we have now, where we're a little more robust and thus able to stay on top of these things better than what we may have done being able to do in the past, and kind of keep this as a much more living and breathing program going forward.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Steger?
Thank you, Chair Berliner. trying to take into consideration some of the public comments we received and just comments within the community. Certainly one of kind of my, I guess, concerns, for lack of a better term, is around the sensitive use areas. And during the staff report, which, thank you very much, Mr. Tilley, this is incredibly thorough and detailed, and we really appreciate that. But in terms of the sensitive use areas, you mentioned that there was an intent to reduce the state requirement to try to prevent kind of excluding some of the areas in which would be good, right, for some of these retail businesses. And I'm just, for me, I would like to see maybe the overlay with the 600-foot or something in the middle. I don't know that I'm personally have interest in reducing that requirement in order to allow for more areas closer to schools, I guess, specifically. And I think I am in alignment in that way with some of the community members that have been very vocal on this topic. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Steger. I think for the people that submitted public comment virtually, I'd like to get the elephant out of the room here. How far is River City High School from Southport Town Center? Like, are we talking, is it 600 feet? Is it 500 feet? Is it 200 feet?
Yeah, the northern portion, I'd say about roughly northern half of where in the town center, like where the auto parts store is and Nugget and those areas are definitely would be outside those buffers. I think the stuff on the very southern end, like where Target is likely too close, not only to the high school, but also OLG.
Okay.
So we have attempted to, and this map is still obviously very broad. We got to really zoom in on some of those areas, but we have attempted to apply some of those buffers from known places like that and other schools in the community that have some proximity to commercial, just so we don't send somebody down the wrong path right out the chute and then say, oh, sorry, no, that's not going to work. You're too close to a school. So we tried to put some math and science into this. Might not be 100% perfect, but we wanted to get something going here, especially graphically, so folks could see the potential here, but also make sure that we do address some of those compatibility concerns, as Commissioner Steger mentioned.
Okay, so I'm going to reiterate, we are more than 600 feet away from River City High School near the auto parts store.
Yeah,
okay.
along there, that northern edge, kind of like along the Lake Washington side.
Okay.
And then we'd also have to, verify that from OLG, but there certainly could be some potential in town center once we zoom in on those areas.
And for the record, I'm not advocating that we put retail cannabis in that shopping center, but I think that we do need to think about having it evenly distributed throughout the city if we move forward with this. I do have several questions, is probably putting it lightly, but is there a cap for the number of retail cannabis stores?
Yeah. Staff is not proposing a cap.
So why is staff then proposing a lottery? And I want to sort of follow up with, given the current landscape, wouldn't it make sense to have some sort, given the current landscape, given that we've had several cannabis manufacturing conditional use permits come before the commission since, in the last 4 years, but not all have come into fruition, similar to the apartment complexes and, mixed use development that we've had I'm talking about the ones on Jefferson, come into fruition. Wouldn't it make sense to maybe have a first come, first serve application system? But, so I gotta, okay. But if there are two, would it make sense to have a first come, first serve system? There we go. I'll start there.
I would say that if we are going to get as many applications as what, many folks have intimated to us, we could be overwhelmed.
Okay.
Quite frankly, if it was first come, first serve. And I know our director, who deserves the lion's share of the credit for the great staff report tonight, has some input on that too.
All right, go ahead.
I am sorry. Thank you, David. I'm Andrea Ausa, Community Development Director. Hello, Commissioners and Chair Berliner.
Hi.
I did just want to add a little bit more to that, in that the first come, first serve doesn't speak to the quality of the application, right? So the merit-based component that we are proposing will allow the third-party contractor to evaluate on the merits of the applications and to be able to provide us with a score. But if it were a first come, first serve, we would not be able then to evaluate the quality of the applications.
So I guess my question is, say you have 50 applicants or 12 applicants, but the third-party administrator, if you will, has only deemed 6 or 10 of them. If you have 50, that's only 10 or 4 or 5 or, whatever, are, qualified. What you would then have them go through a lottery system for that, even if they're all proposing to be in different parts of the town?
Well, at that point, the lottery could then, through chance, if there are 2 or more competitors for the same property, which, by the way, is more common than you would expect.
No, I get that, yeah.
Then it would, by chance, then allow for those already qualified applications then to allow for the top, or the one that wins the lottery, to be able to move forward with the cannabis license.
So we're not concerned about 2 entities vying for the same exact location, because those businesses will have made some sort of agreement with.
Not necessarily.
So if they haven't made an agreement with the landlord, why wouldn't the city allow the landlord to decide who they would rather do business with?
Well, in my experience, and this is the third community that I've worked in where we have worked on cannabis policy and programs. In my experience, the definition of what site control is, or what property owner approval is or acceptance is, varies wildly. So we would need to define what that is, whether it's a property owner signature on an application, or proof of a lease, or whatever it is. But it ultimately would be up to the property owner to say, I'm going to lease to this business versus that business. But sometimes what they do is they make tentative agreements with one or more.
Okay.
So, and that is obviously outside of the city's control.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I follow up on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just have a question on, so it's merit-based and lottery, right? So say we have to reach the lottery component. Say we have someone that had a 98%, and then we have someone that's just at 80%. Will the 98% person would that be weighted in the lottery they would get? Their chances of getting picked would be greater?
No, it's entirely up by chance. We're proposing that it be a true lottery.
Okay.
Ping pong balls, whatever it is, but yeah, truly by chance.
So I guess from the city's perspective and wanting a business that's going to go forward and succeed, it seems to me that if you had someone that scored higher, they would have a better chance of succeeding and actually operating.
So that's why we would establish at least a minimum threshold for qualification, so that given the criteria that David talked about, and depending on the scoring and the evaluation of each application on its merits, ostensibly those that would enter the lottery are the most qualified.
Okay, so I guess you would think that anyone that met that threshold have equal chances of succeeding, in theory.
In theory, yes.
Okay. And then how does the council's direction to focus on equity play into the selection process? Does that weighted into the, I'm just looking at the staff report and I didn't see it in there.
Right. And I can certainly shift this back to David for his input. Essentially, these are parallel programs and separately considered. Well, meaning we have the basic components of the equity program, but we would need to get more commission and council and public input on the equity program and its provisions prior to, building it into a full-fledged equity program. So the non-equity program that we're talking about is not necessarily interactive with the equity program that we're proposing.
Okay, so they're two different tracks.
Essentially, we're considering them publicly together, but operationally speaking, they would be on two separate.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for interjecting.
No problem. I lost my place. Does anyone have any other questions while I find my place? Okay, go ahead, Commissioner
I
DeAnda.
just want to go back to the overlay zone. Does the city have the ability to identify specific locations that could be exempted, or the ability to, there's a range, right? So I thought I saw state law says you can go up to 600 feet. Is that could we have different ranges for different locations? Then I'm going kind of back to say, like, schools, particularly River City or the elementary schools, where you had those at 600 feet, but other places could be at 250. I'm not sure.
So we could set up different buffers for different types of sensitive uses, but if we start putting a 600-foot buffer around one parcel and a 200-foot buffer around other parcels, that becomes problematic.
Okay.
I have a related buffer sensitive use question. Does our definition of sensitive use, does that track the state definition?
It largely does, and we've taken it a step further to make it clear what it also does not include. Some of the language in the state, the state regs could be interpreted to mean a lot of different things. I think it's, youth centers and well, what is that? So we have tried to be more specific, and focusing on things where students, particularly, students say of a, teenage or older life, where they would perhaps be, for an extended period of time, say, versus a, once a week martial arts class where they may be there for 45 minutes or something like that, versus, say, like the Collins Teen Center where kids are there for, several hours, in the afternoon. It's just a different environment. So, and this is something we put in, certainly on the direct recommendation of our consultant HDL, to be very, very explicit about what we mean, what the buffer applies to and what it would not apply to.
Does Target count as a community youth center? There seem to be a lot of youth there after school.
It seems that way, but I think officially that's a retail store.
But so I'm just trying to recall our discussion on sensitive uses at our workshop, and my recollection is we were more tending towards why is there a buffer at all? But I may have a foggy thing, because when you look at, there are other uses like alcohol, liquor stores, right? Do we have buffer for those? And,
Not in our zoning code. There are certain limitations, I think, with, from ABC, for example. But even now, Target, spitting distance from the high school, and OLG sells, all forms of alcohol, for example. So there are some limits there, but we don't have anything in our own municipal code that says, businesses that sell alcohol have to be X distance away from. The only other thing we have that's even remotely analogous would be adult uses.
and did council provide direction on sensitive use buffer?
They definitely indicated they wanted to have some buffer. We didn't receive a specific number. So first thing we did after that meeting is we went back and started applying the stock 600-foot buffer, and you'd be surprised it did wipe out quite a bit of the areas, existing commercial areas, measuring it as the crow flies, particularly in our central business district, where there's some charter schools and things like that, plus the Collins Teen Center. So we've tried to find a happy medium there, if you will, so that we don't unduly restrict otherwise viable existing commercial areas. And this is all a balancing act in terms of, we get super strict on that, it's going to really limit the number of places going to go, and that's going to create a much higher barrier to entry, into this space. So we're trying to find that nice middle ground where we have opportunities so that hopefully costs can be reasonable, but at the same time not have it be a total free-for-all either. So that's what we've been really noodling on probably the most during this time period, is how can we set this up where the barriers are not too low but also not too high.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see what that 250-foot overlay looks like with buffer zones. But yeah, because if, we want this, or council's direction, it's part of the initiative to generate revenue, we don't want it to be too restrictive such that there's not many places you can actually operate.
I'm gonna throw kind of off topic, but still on topic. Would there be a requirement for retail storefronts to be discreet? So I know that in Sacramento, I will tell a funny anecdotal story. There is a dispensary near Bevmo in Midtown. And I thought they sold cookies, and they do not, in fact, sell cookies. And when I got carded at the door, I was like, oh, this is not where I want to be, because I wanted cookies. Are there going to be any such discrete, I don't know if that's a Sacramento City ordinance, or if they just kind of took it upon themselves to, not display the product in the window.
So a portion of that, the displaying products in the window, that's a state requirement.
Okay.
Cannabis product can't be visible from the street. And that's another piece that kind of feeds into the exposure to youth that's built into the state regulations, so that kids walking by can't just see everything in the shop window the way that they could for other types of retail uses.
Okay. Thank you. I was pretty embarrassed by that. And then going back to the lottery, just because, I think the lottery is important if we're having a lot of people apply, but when people are going through this RFP process, and you've sort of disqualified several people, several entities from being able to even participate in the lottery, what point is this lottery triggered? Say you go through this process and you only have 4 eligible retailers, would you make them go through the lottery?
We need to take a quick break until we have Commissioner Sablon back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And that's because we don't have a quorum currently, but we will again once she returns.
Mr. City Attorney, Mr. Secretary, I think we have a quorum back.
Yes, so we can continue.
Apologies, I'm not used to when we're just having 4 people.
So just to reiterate my question, maybe a little less lengthy, at what point is a qualified lottery triggered? I think it's really vague, and I know that vagueness is good, but I'm just curious because I know that I know that we need to have safeguards in place, but I don't want the process to be overburdensome.
Yeah, and neither do staff, and that's what we're trying to find, that, again, that's sort of that sweet spot there. The lottery, could be triggered by several different factors. I mean, part of it could just be quantity of applications. I mean, there's a practical amount of how many we could actually entertain at any given time and still do all of our other work on other important policy initiatives. Certainly a lottery would come into place if, 2 companies were vying for the exact same spot. Or if more than one was going in an area where, let's say on West Capitol, where the 500-foot buffer is going in, if 2 of them are going right next door to each other or want to go right next door to each other, well, that can't happen. So how do you pick between the 2? And so we don't want to, so the lottery and then doing it by chance, we feel like is the most, equitable way, under the assumption that we will get numerous applications. Most everyone, including what we heard tonight, has told us we will get numerous applications. We'll see. And also, I would anticipate that we may open this up, but that we won't do it just once. We may do it, a second time, maybe the following year, depending on how it goes and how many we have and who actually gets up and running. It's a long road from this stop to when you're actually, click your open sign to be on there, and so some may not get all the way, but we do anticipate getting numerous applications. So we believe that the lottery process of this, on top of the merit, is very important because we very well could get more than we could realistically handle, at once. I have a staff of, basically going to be 3 people who would be administering these, plus myself, potentially, and that's fine. But we have numerous other initiatives that we need to be working on at the same time, and so we're trying to design a program that would be as objective across the board as possible, under the presumption that we will get numerous applications, and it's certainly possible that many of those will meet those initial merit thresholds as well. There's a lot of experienced operators out there, as we've heard tonight, and so we certainly would anticipate many of them being able to put together, a quality initial application. And so we need to have these safeguards to make sure that we're just not overwhelmed. We couldn't entertain 30 applications for anything at the same time, truthfully.
But isn't the third-party contractor administrator going to have to review all of the RFPs anyway?
Yes, they will be. They will be the ones that would actually do the scoring, the evaluation and scoring, to see who meets that, crosses that minimum threshold and who doesn't. But certainly in our looking at other places, they do tend to get quality applications from experienced operators. So we still expect that even if we get 30 applications in, it's certainly conceivable that 20 of them, may pass muster that initial screen, and thus we would need to employ the lottery. It all comes down to how many we get, but for now we're assuming we will get quite a few.
Okay. I'd like to bring this back to the commission to sort of talk about where we want to go with this. Because we either have to continue this, or we have to make a motion on staff's recommendation, right? Those are our two options?
Yes, those are basically the options. You
Okay.
could continue it, you could move it forward to the council as recommended by staff, or you could make modifications to what you'd like to see presented to the council.
Okay. Oh, my last question is, based on the public comment we got about having, the applicant, the RFP basically indicate that they already have a location in mind and it taking several years and working in state government, I know that that's not actually wrong in terms of how long it takes. Would it be possible to, as part of the RFP scoring process, include access or plan of the location as part of that scoring, but not necessarily a requirement to apply? Does that make sense? Like, I know it makes things a little bit more difficult, but it seems like startup funds are very high.
Yeah, for any discretionary application that we get, we need at a minimum property owner consent.
Okay.
So that applies across the board.
What if they were to provide you with several property owner consents and then they figure out at the end where they're going to go?
In that scenario, that may mean multiple applications.
Okay.
And, each site needs to be evaluated, on its own merits at that point.
Okay.
So I'm sensitive to the argument about, buildings potentially being tied up. I think in our community, part of why we're entertaining this is we have space available that is not attracting a lot of interest from other businesses. So if properties start to get tied up and landlords start receiving at least, some level of rent versus nothing is not necessarily the worst case scenario, worst thing in the world. But we already know that there's at least some buildings in town where people have already cut deals and are paying rent as we speak, just betting on the come that this program will ultimately be approved and they would be able to submit an application eventually. So some of that's already happening, and clearly that's some of the more well-resourced entities that are out there. But this can't be something where we go through all of that. It's like if I brought you a housing project, but then didn't tell you where it was, it would be kind of hard to evaluate.
That's fair. Okay. So those, I have exhausted my page of questions. Okay. Bringing it back to Commissioner. Oh, nope. Commissioner DeAnda has a question. Or a follow-up, I guess.
A follow-up, I guess. You mentioned the equity program would operate kind of on a separate track. And I know you showed a timeline earlier. We anticipate that would be ready to operate at the same time as the general program, correct?
Yeah, I would hope so, and I would expect that would be what the council would be looking for.
Okay.
Also, I see that sort of being a subset, of this. So hopefully we can help where an equity applicant wouldn't be sort of in a feeding frenzy against the much bigger fish, out there.
Yeah.
So that's partially why, for example, we've at least entertained the notion of maybe the city even acquiring a building and becoming a landlord and cutting off some of that market-based realities out there that they would face and probably have a tough road to hoe compared to some of the more well-resourced.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I think in general, I'm in support of this item. To me, the biggest issue is the equity program. I would like to see as much preference or first crack given to that program as possible. I think if you look at some of the areas that were mentioned, other jurisdictions, and certainly just kind of regionally, West Sac's still relatively small compared to a lot of these places, and so it's still very much kind of a small town. We're growing 50,000 plus, but I would like to see preference given to someone in the community as much as possible, all things else being equal. So I would just, I guess, just the one thing that I would like to really kind of specify in this is that at minimum that, yeah, that program, that equity component is launched at the same time as the general program, because I would not want large corporate entities coming in and essentially kind of buying up all of the locations and taking all of the permits, and therefore kind of blocking those that could come in through the equity path. So I would just want to make sure that, you know, that's ready to go at the same time, at minimum, if not before.
So doing a program that favors local residents only is not exactly a legal way that we can limit land use regulations, which this essentially amounts to. But for the equity program, we will look to see how we can incentivize it for.
Yeah, I understand it wouldn't be based solely on, but in terms of however the scoring is done through that equity program, if there was some incentive or some way to, I don't know, reward an applicant based on whatever criteria.
Would it be possible to have priority to applicants that live in priority populations as designated by Cal EnviroScreen 4.0?
I don't know, but we can definitely look at that.
Okay, cool. Okay. So I have in my notes that if we do move the staff's recommendation, that we would want to add the River Point Marketplace to the overlay map, as well as maybe any other business centers that were missed. Okay. And then the equity program being launched at roughly the same time as the main program. And Commissioner Sablon, you look like you're about to say something.
Well, I just wanted to recommend, I don't know how difficult this would be for staff to prepare, just in case council wants other options aside from the 250 feet buffer, you know, if they can see what it looks like with a 400, a 250, and a 100. There's some variation, so they have some consideration if they want to increase or decrease, just so they have an idea of how that affects the available spaces in the overlay. And if that's just way too much trouble, just you can shoot.
Yeah, that's a good GIS exercise. So I do think that might be certainly of value for the council's consideration on that particular component. I suspect that will be important, as it has been for the Planning Commission.
And then I keep coming back to the lottery system. I'm just very concerned that there aren't enough guardrails behind. It's incredibly vague. It's very vague. What triggers it is really vague, is my only concern. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think Mr. Tilley said that the actual, like the specifics of the program would be developed by the city manager or council at a later date. Is that?
Yeah, the part of the ordinance is, would set up, if approved as written, that the city manager would be tasked with developing all the details of the administrative policy of how we're going to entertain these, which would include the lottery. We haven't gone that far yet because we haven't received a ton of direction from council on this, and certainly getting into those type of nuances. But we certainly expect that they will inform on that, and then that will provide more guidance for the city manager, who will then delegate that down to Andrea, who will then delegate it down to me to work on that and flesh all that out administratively. We need to get the fundamentals established, first, and then we can start putting a lot more detail in there based on what we ultimately hear from the commission and the council.
Would it be possible for that exercise that you do to come before, us as an informational item, just like the lottery guardrails, if you will.
We can certainly carry that forth to the council if that's something that they would want the planning commission to see. Right now it's set up where the city manager would establish that.
Okay.
And it's up to if the council will want to see that also.
Okay. Commissioner Steger? All right.
Before there's a motion, just for clarity, any motion that modifies the map, if the commissioner making the motion could be very clear about what additions or subtractions from the map they're looking for.
I think,
River Point Market.
so would it, saying adding River Point and other retail, high visibility retail areas that were left off?
River Point is probably specific enough. Other retail is a little bit vague as to what staff should add. So cross streets, names of business parks.
Yeah, I recall Chair Berliner referencing the commercial area along Jefferson, kind of between 15th and Stone, on the west side of Jefferson.
Yeah.
If that would be something the commission wanted to entertain, great if you could, sort of articulate it in that matter for the record.
Can I ask city attorney a question, like not on the microphone? Yeah, I think secretary, yeah. Okay.
If the area you're concerned about can't be added because of conflict, I would encourage you to maybe make a comment to the city council to have that added at that time.
Okay. So Commissioner Sablon, were you
Well,
making?
Well, I was going to make a motion if we're,
Okay.
unless other commissioners still wanted.
How are we feeling? We're good?
So I think staff did a great job fielding all of our questions. So thank you very much, and thank you to the public that came out to speak today and the comments we received before this. I think the ordinance is quite thorough and really is trying to move forward the strategic plan goal of having retail cannabis in place. So I would move to approve staff recommendation with some modifications to modify the overlay map to add River Point shopping center on there, and to recommend to council that we add other retail places they identify that have been left out, including the retail locations on Jefferson.
Between 15th and Stone.
Between 15th and Stone. And then there's also on 15th, there is one retail location right next to the fire station. I didn't think I saw that on there either.
Okay, so I think one of the places you just identified as an issue as far as a conflict here. Okay, so we'd need to remove that one, and I'll let the chair identify which one that was. And so the recommendation could be more broad as far as the overlay map to the council to identify additional retail areas that the council deems appropriate.
Okay.
But as far as what the map is coming out of this meeting, please just include the specific areas you'd like to include.
Okay, so I would move to improve staff recommendation and with the modification of the overlay map to include River Point on the overlay.
Okay.
And then also with the provision that the equity program move in parallel with the other track. And then also with the provision of GIS overlay for council with varying buffers, so there's some idea for them to decide on the 250 buffer sensitive areas.
We have a second.
I'll second.
Madam Clerk?
Commissioner DeAnda,
Aye.
Commissioner Sablan,
Aye.
Commissioner Steger,
Aye.
and Chair Berliner.
Aye. All right, motion passes. So will council be looking at, did we include that council looks at possible business? Never mind. It's very complicated. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
part of the motion was that council consider additional retail areas that they deem appropriate.
Okay, cool, thank you.
And the overlay map that will go before them will include the River Point Shopping Center.
Okay, great, thank you. And just for the people who are watching and the people in the audience, I live very close to Jefferson Boulevard, off of 19th and Jefferson, so there would have been a conflict of interest for me to approve anything within 500 feet of my house. That being said, let's move on to administration function part 2, Commissioner Communications. I believe that this is the last meeting of the year. Am I wrong?
Based on your action tonight, I do believe this will be the last time we meet for this calendar year. So I'd obviously like to thank you and all the other commissioners for your service on this and working through being on Zoom and then coming into doing it live and that transition. And it was just great that everyone finally got to hear it, actually got to meet each other, believe it or not. So I will send out a formal communication about our schedule, but I do anticipate this will be our last meeting for the year. So I do hope that everybody enjoys the upcoming holiday season. And I certainly hope that we'll all see each other certainly before next year rolls around and we start getting back on the Planning Commission track.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I just want to echo his comments and also say I hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving and happy winter holidays, if you will, depending on what you celebrate or don't. And does anyone else have anything to say before we adjourn?